بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في غزة. اللهم انصر أولياءك في غزة وفي فلسطين كلها وفي اليمن وفي لبنان. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدو منك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة وفي فلسطين كلها وفي اليمن وفي لبنان في كل مكان. اللهم فرج عنا وعنهم ونفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين. اللهم نتوسل إليك بشهداء غزة أن تقبل دعانا وتحقق رجانا. وصل وسلم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وآله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. So Descartes supplement this argument by another, the argument we just described in the last session. We have, and that argument is, I think I also already talked about it, but we'll just read it again. We have the idea of a perfect being in our mind. What is the source of that idea? That's Descartes' argument. It cannot come from nature because there's no perfection in nature. Nature exhibits nothing but change. You don't have to say that nothing but change, but there's no perfection in nature. That would be Descartes' argument. It cannot create the idea of a perfect being. Therefore, corresponding to the idea of in our mind, there must be an objective counterpart, which is the cause of the idea of a perfect being in our mind. This argument is somewhat of the nature of cosmological argument, which I have already criticized. I don't think there's any relation to cosmological argument as such, at least not on the face of it. And I don't think, obviously, that's not Iqbal's focus. So he hasn't described Descartes' argument entirely correctly, because for Descartes' argument is based on his idea that the mind or the ideas within mind are more certain than our experience of the external world, which come through senses. And as long as we are attentive, and that's important, and focused, and our ideas are clear and distinct, those ideas must be certain. And if they are certain, then in a sense they are true. So if we have an idea of a God which is perfect, and this idea is clear and distinct, then it must exist. The argument is somewhat like that. So we already went through it, so we don't have to rehearse it again. So Descartes' argument does draw or does claim that God's essence implies his existence. And that's the hallmark of ontological argument, distinct from other sort of arguments or cosmological argument. As Descartes says in meditation, for example. So Descartes says in meditations, for example, I'm not free to think of God without existence. So thinking is essence. So clearly there is a connection between essence and the existence in God. So I'm not free to think of God without existence. That is a supreme being without perfection. So existence is perfection. So how can I think of a supreme being who does not exist? So it's a contradiction in terms. But that's different from, for example, I'm free to think of a horse. So I have an idea of horse. I can think of a horse without wing, but with wing. But I can also think of a horse without wing. But as I mentioned before, and the example of a horse and a wing makes it clear that, in some sense, um, Descartes treats existence as a predicate, and that's where not only his Thomist critics, I so that was the objection of Kant, obviously later. But even in Descartes' time, his Thomist critics, who were more married to cosmological argument, they criticized him for this very thing that existence is not a predicate. Obviously, they didn't use this language, but what they said was that conception doesn't imply existence, and that's where Iqbal is going here. But he is going, is developing his argument with reference to Kant. But whatever may be the form of argument, it's clear that the conception of existence, conception, is no proof of objective existence. So there's a difference between a conception of existence and objective existence. So you might, in your conception, you might be able to say that supreme being must exist. So if you have a conception of supreme being, that might be a contradictory conception. If you say that within this conception, he is supreme being, but he does not exist. So that's a contradiction without your conception. So that's fine. But that doesn't mean that apply to objective existence. So in order for the contradiction to exist in objective manner, that supreme being has to exist first. So contradiction in a conception doesn't mean that, or doesn't imply that supreme being necessarily exists. So that's a key difference between conception of existence and objective existence. Conception of existence doesn't imply objective existence, and that's the same thing which Kant says when he says that existence is not a predicate, but it's the ground for all predicates to exist objectively. Yeah. So, as in Kant's criticism of this argument, the notion of $100, $300 in my mind cannot prove that I have them in my pocket. So that's the distinction in my mind. So that's a notion. So that's a conception of existence. But pocket, that's an objective existence. Let's see, what is he referring to? There is referring to Kant. Well, This is Smith's translation or translation. Normally it should be referring to AB if that's easier to check across the editions. Okay, so all the argument that is ontological argument proves, all that the argument proves is that the idea of perfect being includes the idea of its existence. Idea of perfect being, the idea itself or conception, include idea of existence or conception of existence. Between the idea of a perfect being in my mind and the objective reality of that being, there is a gulf which cannot be bridged over by a transcendental act of thought. The argument as stated is in fact a petitio principii, that is begs the question. It takes for granted the very point in question, that is the transition from logical to the real. So that's in Kantian terms the development. I think that the way Iqbal explains it is quite clear, and that was the same argument which. So as I said, we didn't have to wait for Kant for this argument, which Iqbal develops here. For example, Descartes' critics, his contemporaries, who were Christian critics, for example, who were the followers of Aquinas, who were married to cosmological argument rather than ontological argument. They said, for example, even if it is granted that a supremely perfect being carries the implication of existence in virtue of its very title, it still does not follow that the existence, if it still does not follow the existence of existence in question in the actual and the real world. All that follows is that the concept of existence, so they make this distinction, concept of existence is inseparably linked to the concept of supreme being. So the distinction Iqbal makes between objective existence and conceptual existence is employed in this argument, which was developed by Descartes' Thomas critics at the time. But I think Kant's argument doesn't really address the core of Cartesian position. And core is ideas are more certain than impression of senses, ideas of mind, that is. When mind is attentive and the ideas are clear and distinct, that means they have certainty. And since certainty is equal to truth, and how can there be something true without existence if it is claiming to exist? So in order to reject Descartes, actually, you have to reject his method first. I'm not saying you can't reject his method. You can reject his method, but just on the basis of the Kantian distinction between conception of existence and objective existence, you can't reject Descartes' argument, I think, in Cartesian term, at least. Okay, so we are almost done here. I hope I've made it clear to you that the ontological and teleological argument, as ordinarily stated, carry us nowhere. And now he goes on to develop his own point, so we'll take that from here. next session إن شاء الله. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. وصل وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا